pleasure to welcome Olivier Sibony for a session focused on the decision-making process. So Olivier is a professor and an advisor specialized on strategic thinking and the design of decision process. He teaches at strategy and problem solving, that's right, at HEC, so in Paris, so the business school, and previously has been for 25 years at McKinsey in France and the US, and being a senior partner with his firm. So he's also, for the French participant, I don't know if you know Time to Sign Off, the TTSO, but it's a blog, and Olivier is the author of the 30-second MBA, which is always very pleasant to read. So now the floor is yours, Olivier, and thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you very much. Good evening. This is not going to be a 30-second MBA, but it's not going to be much longer. It's going to be about 20 minutes. I want to talk to you about decisions. And you're all decision makers. You all make business decisions, obviously, like trading decisions. You make people decisions. We heard about diversity earlier today. These are important decisions. You make all kinds of decisions, including in your personal life. And we hear a lot these days that all decisions have to be based on data and on big data and on algorithms and science and technology. And there's some truth to that. Because as we all know, there has been an explosion in computing power. It's basically, even before Moore's law, it's been multiplied by a factor of 10 every 5 years since basically computers were invented. And now there's so much data, there's an exponential growth in the quantity of data available, which makes it possible to train algorithms to solve problems that we didn't imagine could be solved. And as a result, we see lots of applications, but the questions I'd like to explore with you today is what decisions can we actually make using this kind of big data, and what decisions should we make in other ways, and what other ways? So, big data does a lot of things. Filling your tax form is the sort of thing that, frankly, a computer has been able to do for a while, unless you've got extraordinarily complicated taxes, which may be the case for a lot of people in this room, actually, now that I think of it. Controlling your identity at the airport. That's something that, until very recently, a machine couldn't do, but now you see those machines everywhere that look at your face and say, yeah, that's you, it corresponds to the picture in your passport. Checking out at the cafeteria is something that you can now do with a machine. In fact, even in a store, Amazon has now shown that you can have stores where cameras identify everything you buy and you don't need to check out. This can be automated. Even driving a car will very soon be something that can be very easily automated. Essentially, what these things have in common is that they follow rules. For each of those things, there is a set of rules. There aren't two different ways to check out the cafeteria tray that you see there. There even aren't that many ways to drive a car. If you know you want to go from A to B and you want to respect traffic rules, there is only basically one way to do that. And if there's two, there's a better way to figure out which one it is, and Waze will tell you. So all these things are about following rules. Even very complicated things, very high-stakes things can be rule-following things. Even flying a plane follows rules. You don't expect any initiative or judgment or creativity from the guy flying your plane. Even controlling a nuclear power plant is about following the rules. If there's an accident, you can tell the rules haven't been followed. So there's lots of things that are very important. This doesn't mean that they're menial tasks. They can be very important, and they follow rules. The problem is that those things will very soon be automated if they aren't. They can all be automated using artificial intelligence and big data. But there's a lot of things that actually do not follow rules. And that's where things get interesting. For instance, when you decide to get married, are you applying an algorithm? I hope not. Even your personal finance, I assume, if it's like mine, well, maybe it's not like mine because it's kind of your job, but still, I would expect it doesn't quite follow very easy to define rules. So there is some judgment there. A lot of things that we take for granted in society are done by experts, judges who decide to release someone on bail awaiting trial, for instance, do it basically based on judgment. We see amazing variations, by the way, in the judgment of bail judges. In the US, it's been shown that some judges are 20 times more likely to release people on bail than others. So when there's judgment, there's a lot of variation. Medical imaging, when you see a radiologist and the radiologist looks at your image and says, it's fine, you can go home, you've got no problem, that's a judgment. There's no precise rule. If you ask them how they know that this dot here is actually not a tumor, they say, well, I know from experience, I've learned, it's a judgment, but I can't explain to you in detail all the rules that correspond to this. If you ask a college admissions officer how they decide that one candidate gets in and another one doesn't, that's a judgment. It doesn't follow a very precise set of rules. And of course, if we go to business, many of the things we do in business are judgments. Even technological things like maintenance, deciding that one particular piece of machinery needs to be maintained now and another one can wait, that's actually very often a judgment. It's very often not automated. When you decide to hire someone, it's a judgment. You don't just check the boxes. And of course, if we go to the really big decisions, should we attack this cave where maybe, or this compound where maybe bin Laden is hiding, that's a decision for which there is no rule book. So the more important the decision, the more strategic, the more likely it is that actually it's not a rule-following decision. So does that mean that we can have no data and no automation and no science there? Not necessarily. Actually, let's take an example. Maintenance. That's actually a classic application of artificial intelligence. Elevators, for instance. If you look at how elevators are maintained nowadays, they install lots of sensors that detect things like temperature changes and the time that it takes for the doors to close and the time that it takes for the elevator to travel between two floors. And all this information that didn't used to be collected is now collected. It goes into the cloud, it's analyzed by powerful algorithms, and that helps send a signal to a technician to say, go check out this particular elevator because we suspect this one might actually break down tomorrow instead of being on a fixed schedule. And that delivers a lot of savings. So this is an application of artificial intelligence to what used to be the judgment of a technician, but actually is improved by data and intelligence. Another example, medical imaging. Actually, there's studies fairly recently that show that you can actually train algorithms to look at those images and to do a better job than the radiologists of distinguishing tumors from non-tumors. And this is being applied to various types of medical imaging, but there are a lot of specialists now saying basically we should stop training radiologists because that's a job that's going to disappear, just like the job of the cashiers at the supermarket. Maybe that's a bit extreme, but at least it's the direction in which we're headed. Why is that? Because these two applications are examples where, yes, it's a judgment, there is no rule, but we're fine with optimizing the probability. Essentially, when your radiologist says, this isn't a tumor, you can go home safely, what she's saying is, I'm 70% confident, or I'm 90% confident that this isn't a tumor. And she's going to be right 80% of the time. And that's fine. And if you actually find a machine that is right 97% of the time, after a while, after you've overcome the problem of actually being told by a machine that you're sick or healthy, you will accept that being right 97% is better than being right 80% because we know what right is. Now, the problem is that in many cases, it's actually not even possible to be probabilistic. For instance, let's take hiring, which is a fascinating application on which we happen to have a ton of research. When people do hiring, the first step is to screen resumes. And if you've done it, you know it's not fun. It's a fairly boring thing. And so there's a lot of companies, startups essentially, that propose, mostly, not only, that propose applications of AI to screen resumes. And the pitch is very simple. I'm going to identify the keywords in the resumes because it's very easy to read them. I'm going to identify, based on large databases of who's been successful in your company, what it takes to be successful. And so using machine learning and predictive algorithms, I'm going to have a process that saves you time by telling you who you should interview and who you shouldn't, which is going to be very cheap, which of course is going to be totally unbiased. So I'm going to eliminate all the biases, like the gender biases, for instance, that your resume screeners might have. And it won't be perfect at the beginning, but it will improve continuously. So it sounds like a great application, doesn't it? But actually, when you talk to the people who are doing this, you have several problems, at least three. First problem is you think it's unbiased, but actually the machine learns from a database that is your history. So if your workforce has 100% of men and no women, the algorithm is going to say, to be a good candidate, you need to be a man. Now, of course, when you say that to the people who develop these algorithms, they say, but of course, we're aware of this problem and we control for it, which is very easy because you know who is a man and who is a woman. The problem is, if you can control for a discrimination that you're aware of, how do you control for the discrimination that you're not aware of? Essentially, this is a prejudice or a bias that we can identify, and so we can actually correct it, but what we cannot do is tell the machine to correct for the biases that we've had that we're not aware of. If you've been discriminating against people with blonde hair, hypothetically, you will keep discriminating against people with blonde hair, which would be stupid, because you've been doing it in the past and the machine will learn from what you've done in the past. So whatever the machine does will necessarily be based on what you've done before, and that can actually be a problem. Second problem is, when you ask the people who are doing this, how do you know the machine is doing a good job? Well, there's two cases when it's easy. If the machine says the person is good and you think the person is good, and the machine says the person is bad and you think the person is bad, you say, yeah, the machine is right. Easy. But actually, when the machine says, you should see this person, and this was a resume that you wouldn't have selected, what are you going to say? You're going to say, well, that's interesting. Maybe it's actually someone we should see. And the machine has helped us spot talent that we would otherwise have missed. And if the machine tells you, no, you shouldn't see this person, but in fact the human judge would have seen the person, most likely it's in fact a person who went through the resume screening but who was turned down afterwards in the interview phase. And so what you're going to conclude in 90% of the cases is, we could have saved time. So basically what you will conclude is that the machine is always right. And the problem you have here, the logical flaw in this reasoning, obviously, because there is one, is that if you don't know what good is, how can you teach the machine? And on many applications that are based on judgment, you actually never know what good would have been. Should you have seen this candidate? If the candidate turns out to be a bad employee after you hire the candidate, will it be because you made a bad decision in the interviews or a bad decision in the screening phase? Or in fact, it was a good hire, but a lot of things turned out to make this person a bad hire? It's impossible to tell. So how can we train a machine to know what we're looking for if we can't decide with certainty what we're looking for ourselves? And the third problem you have is that actually at some point you need to be able to explain to people why you hire them and of course why you turn them down. And that's a big problem with AI algorithms called interpretability in computer science language, because the algorithms learn all the time and improve all the time, which of course is their great strength. It's impossible to explain a single decision in terms that you can explain to somebody. That's an ethical problem today. In exactly 108 days, it will actually become a legal problem because the general data protection regulation in Europe will require you to be able to explain your decisions to people for whom it has a real significance. So, on applications that require judgment, like hiring, it actually gets tricky to use artificial intelligence. Another example, bail decisions. There's actually a lot of research, not a lot, but some recent research showing that machines could make better decisions on whom to release. In fact, according to at least one study, you could have the same number of people in jail and reduce crime by 25%, or have the same crime rate and reduce jail time by 42%. Sounds like a pretty good idea, except you've got to let the machines decide who goes to jail. And that's something that as a society we're probably not prepared to do for the same reasons that we have for hiring, but compounded by the fact that it's a big decision. Basically what this tells you is that there's a lot of decisions that we're actually not willing or not prepared or not allowed to treat as probabilistic decisions. They need to be matters of judgment, and they will remain matters of judgment. So what does the science of decision making and judgment have to tell us about how to make judgments when we cannot turn them to machines, when we cannot make them the rational decisions, the scientific decisions that we'd all love if we were completely rational people to make? Well, there's a few things we can do. I'll come back to hiring. Here's a story that Daniel Kahneman tells about when he was 22 years old, and Daniel Kahneman would go on, as you know, 50 years later to earn a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on decision making. Kahneman is a lieutenant in the Israeli army at the time, and he's in charge of improving the hiring process because he's essentially determined that the way they hire people for various functions in the army have no correlation with how successful they are afterwards. What did he do? He basically said, let's identify our recruiting criteria. Let's define what we're looking for in our recruits. Let's ask the interviewers to score people on these particular characteristics. And let's ask them to contemplate all this information, to look at all this data before they actually make a holistic decision. So we keep the interviewing. We still interview these people. We keep the intuitive, holistic decision. It's still a person making a judgment about a person. But we actually delay that decision until we have the data. Those three things, formalizing the criteria, asking the people to score them separately, and delaying the judgment until after you have done that, are the same idea that is still in use in that army today, and in fact is still in use in many other places, except that it took them a long time to discover it. You would think, for instance, that a place like Google would be much more technical and quantitative, but actually a few years ago, their head of HR called Laszlo Bock did the same study that Kahneman did in the Israeli army 60 years ago, had the same finding, which was that the ratings that people got in the recruiting interviews had no correlation whatsoever to their success on the job, actually went to the literature on HR and discovered that that's actually a universal rule. In general, interviews are very bad predictors of on-the-job performance. And so he did exactly the same thing that Kahneman had done 50 years before. He said, let's define our criteria, and let's identify how we're going to score people on those criteria with interviews with other data when other data is available, like tests or job sample tests, so you're asking people to do the job. Let's mechanically aggregate the scores on these particular criteria. So let's score people on a scale of 0 to 4 or 1 to 5, and let's propose this to a committee and let them make the final decisions in a collegial manner. That's a very simple way of structuring a judgment, which worked 50 years ago, works today, and actually is proven to be one of the best ways to make recruiting decisions. The same logic, even a little bit more structured, can be applied to the bail decisions that I talked about. You can actually create a simple rule that predicts the risk of delinquency better than most judges. And the rule is based on 2 criteria, and you can explain the criteria very simply, so you can structure the decision quite simply. This is the second way to make a decision, if it's not going to be AI or big data, which is structured decision making. Basically, it's a judgment, but you can structure your judgment to make it more reliable. Reliable in the statistical sense, meaning less noisy, less random. That leaves us with a third category of decisions, which are the ones where you can't structure it because it's a one-off. If tomorrow you decide that you're going to do a hostile IPO on Citibank, there is not a lot of comparative history to base your decision on. You can't say, last time we did this, the criteria were this, and it worked out. And of course, when you make a big political or military decision, as in this example here, it's a big one-off, and what you need is a form of wisdom. So if it's not going to be a structured decision, it's of course not going to be big data, where do you find the wisdom? 2 basic rules that we can illustrate with history, formal decision processes, some rigor in the process, and some collegiality. When I say illustrate with history, I have no better example to give you than this story that you may have read or seen in the movie called 13 Days, of how the Kennedy administration made the fateful decisions that it had to make during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You have to remember that this is 1 year after the same people in the same room on basically the same topic, Cuba, made a fairly terrible decision. They decided to approve the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was, of course, a complete disaster. And so Kennedy thought long and hard about how such a smart group of people let themselves be fooled into making such a stupid decision. And when the time came to actually make an even more fateful decision, because this time the Soviets have nuclear missiles being implanted in Cuba very close to the US, so it's a real threat, how is he going to make that decision? Well, he's going to have some process and he's going to have a lot of collegiality. Process, what does he do? First, he says, you guys in the room, you are here to generate multiple options. The army has come to me, or the military has come to me and has told me we only have two options. Either we invade Cuba and we finish the job that the Cuban emigres didn't do at the Bay of Pigs a year ago, and that's what we recommend, Mr. President, or we do nothing and we'll live with the threat of the Cuban missiles or the Soviet missiles half an hour away from Washington, which is not great. So in one case, you've got the risk of World War III. In the other, you've got the risk of being turned to glass by the Soviets. It's your call, Mr. President. And Kennedy basically tells these guys, these aren't great options. Your task number one is to generate many more better options than these two. And we're going to basically lock you up into a room until you come up with better options. That's a process decision. We're not going to start discussing these options. We're going to ask you to generate more options. Second thing that he tells them is you're going to get facts and intelligence from multiple sources. That's another very important process point. So he puts them in touch with people in various places, in different embassies, different departments, and makes sure they get intelligence. Third, he actually says his brother Bobby and another person in the room are going to be the devil's advocates. He calls them the intellectual watchdogs. And he says, your task in this room is to make sure that if someone floats an idea that is as stupid as the one we approved last year at the Bay of Pigs, you will make sure that idea is shut down. You've got no other task. You're basically the watchdogs. That's the process part. But then he also makes sure he gets some collegiality in that room. So first, who are the people in that room? There are people he trusts. And he tells them, you're here because you're generalists and you're here to solve the problem. You're not here because you represent the foreign, the State Department and the Army and the CIA and the Navy, etc. You're all here as generalists and you're all here to solve the problem and you're going to roll up your sleeves and solve the problem. I want you to work as a team without protocol. In fact, so much without protocol that it seemed messy to the observers at the time. Some of them were quite worried. And in fact, Kennedy realized that one of the things that had doomed them at the time of the Bay of Pigs was that it was very difficult for people in the room to admit that they didn't know and to change their mind, largely because Kennedy was there. And telling the president, yesterday I didn't speak up, but actually this is a stupid idea that I approved, is a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to change your mind or to admit ignorance in front of the President of the United States. And so Kennedy did something quite amazing if you consider that this is actually a decision that, of course, is the most important he has ever made, but in fact is the most important anyone in the world has ever made, arguably. He told them, I'm not going to be in the room. I'll come back from time to time, but I want you to be able to work on your own and to problem solve on your own without being paralyzed by my presence. So Kennedy went away and played golf, or did whatever it is that Kennedy did to have fun, which was probably more fun than golf, and let them do their work and change their mind and come up with good options and evaluate them, and have some collegiality. Formal process and collegiality is how you get wisdom when you're making a one-off decision. So to wrap up, we've got three big buckets of types of decisions. We've got the ones that sooner or later are going to be automated because they follow rules, or because they don't follow rules but can be dealt with probabilistically. And these are two categories, but they will end up in the same place. We've got the ones where you need to create some structure because they are judgment-based decisions, but they're repetitive. And you have the ones where you can't create much structure and you've got to have some wisdom with process and collegiality. And I would suggest one practical thing whenever you have to make a difficult decision, which is to ask yourself what bucket the decision you are looking at falls into, because however hard the decision is and however eager you are to get into the details of making the decision, the first decision always needs to be how you're going to make the decision. With this, why don't we listen to the questions and objections and protests that I'm sure you have at these suggestions?